mentioned this a lot of times. At the Africa CEO Forum, there was a high-level panel discussion under the theme Unlocking the AfCFTA Dividend through regional value chains and public-private partnerships. The session was presented by Brand South Africa in collaboration with Zuko Golimpi, B20 South Africa, and Rand Merchant Bank. And the panel brought together influential voices from both the public and private sectors to explore how the African Continental Free Trade Area can be a catalyst for regional integration, industrial growth, and intra-African trade through strategic partnerships and value chain development. Let's take some excerpts from the event.
And I think the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement is the first institutional framework that is continent-wide that is starting to force us into a conversation about resolving the problem of capital misallocation to optimally get Africa going. So on that front, South Africa, it's not just a South African phenomenon, but it's an Africa-wide phenomenon. And the president was making the point that it's not sustainable to be told that private sector confidence is sitting at a 17% level about the prospects of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, because the very fact that this agreement exists means the African public sector has already made one leap forward in providing a predictable institutional and regulatory framework on how business can be promoted in Africa.
Absolutely, and I think you're quite correct. The issue around the Africa Continental Free Trade Area and its implementation is quite key. A lot of businesses and everyone, I think the issue around the skepticism also falls around the tariff and non-tariff barriers. What is your view in terms of that, and how can the continent ensure that we reduce as much as possible the tariffs and non-tariff barriers to ensure that business can actually do business?
So one of the first protocols in the AfCFTA tackles the tariff barriers to reduce them and essentially the vision is to arrive at a point where in Africa the movement of goods from one country to another is free of any cost. That's the first one. But the major issue is on the non-tariff barriers, and infrastructure is one of them. So the mobility of both capital, goods, but also human beings is very, very central to whether it makes sense for people to move from one area of Africa to another. So there's got to be a ramp up in investment in infrastructure, whether you are thinking about air, logistics. You need to have a flight from South Africa to Abidjan, as we do have now. You need to have a flight from South Africa to Egypt. You need to have a flight from Ethiopia to the other side of the continent so that business people can easily move across the continent. But regionally speaking, you also need to improve investment in your rail infrastructure for the physical movement of goods from one area to another. You need to increase investment in broadband infrastructure so that connectivity is easier across the continent. But there's also the issue of our financial systems. The infrastructure just for the mobility of capital in the financial system is very vital as well. So there's a lot of work that must be done on that front to remove the non-tariff barriers. There's also then the peace and security dimension as well, because part of the risk that the continent has to contend with is that for the kind of ambition we have to see Pan-African growth and development to happen, there must be a sense that when a person is moving from one country or another, their safety and security is guaranteed, but also the safety and security of cargo as well must be guaranteed if we are going to have this integration working out.
In one of the panels yesterday, they spoke about that one article that appeared on The Economists about Africa rising and the scramble for Africa in terms of its minerals. South Africa's position obviously is to ensure that there's value addition. Perhaps you can talk us through some of the initiatives taken by the government to really support industries to ensure that they can do value addition in the country rather than raw materials leaving the continent, leaving the country.
So on the South African front, value addition is a function of a couple of things. The first one is the one that you were talking about with respect to the work of Minister Ramokgopa. The provision of stable, predictable and cheap electricity is very, very vital in the transformation of commodities into finished products. But the other one is the work that we do as the DTIC. We have the CEO of the Industrial Development Corporation here. There's also the DBSA as well. Those are public sector financial institutions that serve to provide cheap and long-term capital to those who want to invest in upstream investment. And then, of course, there's also a whole suite of incentives that we provide as government. It could be tax incentives, it could be cash transfers. We provide all of that in order to make sure that doing business in South Africa is cheaper, it is sustainable, but also there's the investment we do in education as well to provide a skills pool that can justify those investments. So there's a lot of work that we are doing there. There's been also an insistence by the President that we must focus on red tape reduction, so that registering a company in South Africa must be easy. Also for mergers and acquisitions as well. We've been making a strong case with the Competition Commission that we need to improve our turnaround timelines between reviewing an application for a merger and acquisition and approving it, so that partnerships between South African businesses and foreign businesses must be easier at the back of our regulatory framework. So those are the elements that we focus on in trying to make a case for investment in South Africa to take off.
Yeah, you're quite correct, because you need the tape. I always say you need that it needs to change the color.
It must just be blue. Yeah, it could be blue or green tape.
Or green tape, absolutely, so that it becomes easier to do business.
Yeah.
DM, what is the role? What do you believe the role of public-private partnerships are, as well as and blended finance mechanisms in upscaling investments in, again, aligned with the AfCFTA?
So it's two things. You must think about, if someone says, I want to move a product from South Africa, let's say just to Zimbabwe. Let's take our neighbor to Zimbabwe. The first question will be, what mode of transportation am I going to utilize? Then you're going to say rail. Then the question will be, who must lay down the rail infrastructure there? In a situation where you have an overstretched public sector balance sheet, we all agree on the need to build the rail, but we say the public sector doesn't have sufficient money to do that on its own. And then a private investor says, well, I am willing to put rail on the floor to enable this, but I'm going to charge a high tariff in order to recover the money that I've put in here. Now, what blended finance does is that it helps to de-risk the private sector investment. So you bring a public sector institution to co-invest with the private sector firm on that front, so that the tariffing that they impose on the rail is lower than what they would have done on their own. The second issue is that the scale of the risk that each person between the public and private sector has to take up for that project is reduced significantly, and then it makes it less risky and more viable for the both of them to do that. So that's one dimension of it. But the other one is that you also need public sector investment instruments to affect the direction of capital allocation. So if you have DFIs that are gesturing to the market that they are prepared to invest or co-invest in a particular sector of the economy, even in instances where private capital was not paying attention to that sector, once they see that there is a front foot that is being played by the public sector balance sheet, they might then be interested to come in as well. So blended finance has many positives. And it's very vital that in this discussion about the AfCFTA, we stress again the issue of cooperation through public and private partnerships and blended financing in order to realize value across the board.
Some might argue, DM, that we have our DFIs and we have also our commercial banks, and they are very stingy to put their hands in the pockets to ensure that they can allow that access to become available for investors. And if we're talking about also cross-border investments, you find a lot of clients also scrambling, not really sure. They find themselves going to outside the continent to actually raise their capital. What do you see as a danger in that, and what would you suggest as a solution?
So the danger of over-reliance on foreign investment is twofold. The first one is on the pricing of debt. Because banking and financial institutions from outside the continent will rely on their understanding of the continent, when they do the risk matrix on the basis of which they are going to price their debt, sometimes they include variables that we as Africans know don't really matter much, and then the cost of debt goes high. How do we solve that problem? So, and then the banks will make a good point for themselves on this score. They will say, we have depositors' monies. We need to be very careful about what projects do we invest in and how much money we can allocate per project, including cross-border projects. Now, if you bring in DFIs to partner with those commercial banks, the de-risking then comes into that. So if the private sector says for a $300 million US dollar project who are only prepared to put in 150 million US dollars. You can then have DFIs covering the other half of the capital requirement, and then that helps both parts of the equation to be comfortable with the viability of the investment that they are making. So when I was making the point about core financing, I was actually talking about joint initiatives between the African commercial banks and the development finance institutions in the continent, but as well as private industrial investors as well.
No, thank you for that, DM. The other point is, what is your view on intra-Africa trade, getting to a point where we assess the products that are produced within the continent and say, how do we ensure that we procure those products in the continent first before we procure the same products from outside the continent?
In fact, I had a meeting earlier with the Minister of Trade and Industry of Cote d'Ivoire. He was making a point that South Africa has a market for chocolates. But the dynamic is that cocoa will be moved from Cote d'Ivoire into Europe, and then South Africa will import that cocoa from Europe, which is cocoa that is from Cote d'Ivoire. It's an absurdity in terms if you think about it. Yeah. You have a very vibrant domestic market in the continent that can consume this product, but we allow other jurisdictions to be the ones that process this product. So we need to co-invest in capacity building in the continent. It may very well be that Cote d'Ivoire is not in a position from a capital endowment point of view to build processing facilities in Cote d'Ivoire. But South Africa has a much more liquid private sector, and that South African private sector can actually come and build those processing facilities in Cote d'Ivoire and then move those products into South Africa without going via Europe. So we have to take very seriously this way, including oranges. Africa consumes a lot of orange juice, but ask the question, where is the orange coming from and where's the orange juice coming from? Sometimes it's oranges that are farmed in Africa, shipped to Europe, and then they're coming back as the final product, which is, it's an absurdity in terms. We need to leverage the AfCFTA to deal with that problem and build capacity in Africa because demand is there. There's 1.4 billion people in Africa. They need food, they need clothes, they need automotive products, they need cell phones, they need the internet. All of those things can be built by us as Africans, and we can, if we remove those tariff and non-tariff barriers and invest jointly in infrastructure to make the mobility of goods and people easier, we are sitting on a gold, and that gold is us as Africans.